Jeff Bezos says the poorest Americans shouldn't pay income tax, and maybe he's right. But there's something strange happening in modern capitalism. The people at the top no longer deny exploitation exists, they acknowledge it. They talk about inequality. They say workers are struggling. Even billionaires now speak the language of dissent. Slavoj Žižek once argued that capitalism survives by selling you resistance itself, like decaf coffee, beer without alcohol, revolution without consequences. You are allowed to feel angry at the system as long as nothing fundamentally changes. And maybe nowhere captures this contradiction better than Amazon, a company that promises convenience, efficiency and freedom, while thousands of workers quietly wonder why they still can't afford to live. This is Arthur. And Arthur works 40 hours a week in an Amazon warehouse in modern day Britain. He does everything society told him to do. He works, he obeys, he stays out of trouble, and yet somehow he still feels like he's drowning. Arthur wakes up at 5:12 a.m, not because he wants to, because missing the 5:47 a.m. train means being late, and being late means points on the system. 3 warnings, then termination. The room he rents costs 850 quid per month. A single room, no living room access, no guests allowed, no washing machine after 9 p.m. And the landlord calls it professional accommodation, while Arthur calls it mere survival. At work, everything is measured: seconds, packages, movement, efficiency. Even walking too slowly to the toilet becomes data. The scanners watch, the managers watch, the algorithm watches, but nobody has to scream anymore. That's what makes modern work different. The control is invisible. French philosopher Michel Foucault described something similar decades ago: the panopticon, a prison design where prisoners behave because they might be watched at any single moment. Not because force is constant, but because surveillance becomes internalized. And Arthur has started noticing something strange. Nobody at Amazon talks like they're oppressed, not openly at least. Instead, they use corporate language. We're a family. We're empowering workers. We're improving customer experience. Even suffering is rebranded into productivity, and this is where Žižek becomes important, because modern capitalism doesn't survive by denying criticism anymore. It survives by absorbing criticism into itself. And this is where Jeff Bezos recently argued that lower earners shouldn't pay federal income tax. And on the surface, that sounds progressive, even compassionate, dare we say. But Žižek would probably ask a deeper question. Why does the system always offer symbolic relief instead of structural change? Arthur earns just enough to survive, but never enough to escape, and that's important because exhausted people rarely rebel. They work, they recover, they doom scroll, then they repeat the cycle again. By the time Arthur gets home, his feet ache so badly he struggles taking off his shoes. But tomorrow morning the conveyor belts will still move and Arthur will return. Because in modern society, survival itself has become a subscription service. Arthur's grandfather used to tell him stories about post-war Britain. Not glamorous stories, not patriotic stories, stories about ration books, Factories smoked, bombed the streets, and entire neighbourhoods reduced to rubble and ash. But he also spoke about something else, optimism. After the Second World War, Britain rebuilt itself. The government constructed millions of council homes. Entire communities rose from destruction. And for the first time, many ordinary workers had stable housing, running water, electricity, heating, affordable rent, and a future that actually felt reachable. Poverty still existed, don't get me wrong, but it looked different, vastly different. A factory worker could support a family, one income could sustain a household, and despite the hardships, many people genuinely believed their children would live better than they did previously. But Arthur lives in another Britain now, a Britain after deindustrialisation, after privatisation, after the gig economy, and after the pandemic. The factories are gone, but the exhausted workers remain. The exhaustion remains. Only now it wears wireless headphones and carries barcode scanners. And Arthur works inside one of the most technologically advanced logistical systems ever created. Algorithms track movement in real time, packages move across continents within hours, artificial intelligence predicts consumer behaviour before people even purchase products. Humanity has never been this technologically capable or advanced, and yet Arthur can barely afford rent. The room he rents used to be part of social housing. Now it's owned by a landlord who has never repaired the mould spreading across the ceiling. The windows barely close properly. The heating fails during winter. Half his wages disappear the same day he's paid. And Arthur starts wondering something dangerous. If society became more productive, why does survival feel even more difficult, harder and impossible? Why is he working 50, sometimes 60 hours a week just to remain stationary? The Industrial Revolution promised liberation from labour. Machines were supposed to reduce human suffering, human output, human labour. Instead, Arthur feels more monitored than any factory worker from the 19th century. Every second measured, every movement recorded, every delay analysed by software. And even his exhaustion becomes data. And this is where Žižek's critique really becomes relevant, because modern capitalism no longer presents itself as cruel, it presents itself as progressive. Bezos recently argued that lower earners should pay less tax, that ordinary workers are struggling, that the system should be fairer. And maybe he genuinely believes that, but Arthur notices something strange. The people at the top now speak the language of compassion, while the conditions underneath remain completely untouched. The system acknowledges suffering, but suffering continues anyway. So Arthur begins calculating his wages during shifts, £12 an hour, and he thinks about Bezos, about yachts, private jets, billions accumulating faster than Arthur can physically comprehend. And suddenly a question enters his head that he can't remove. Am I building my own life or funding somebody else's? Arthur tries speaking to people around him, co-workers, friends, family, but the responses are always the same. That's life. That's just the system. What else are you gonna do? And slowly Arthur realises something terrifying. The most powerful systems are not the ones people fight against. They are the ones people stop imagining escape from together. Arthur used to think one of his co-workers was different, a man around the same age, friendly, chatty, always complaining about the management under his breath. One night during break, Arthur finally says what's been building in his head for months. I don't think they care about us, not really. These interviews, the tax comments, the concern for workers, it's branding. Basically bullshit. We're just numbers keeping the machine alive. And his co-worker laughed nervously, looked around, then quickly, swiftly changed the subject. A week later, Arthur is called into the office. Low productivity, poor engagement, negative attitude. Management says multiple co-workers reported concerns. One described him as a cultural misfit. Another claimed he spends too much time talking and thinking instead of focusing on targets. Arthur sat there in silence. He wasn't angry, he was just exhausted, because deep down he already knew this was coming. And this is the final stage of the system Žižek talks about. Modern capitalism doesn't merely exploit workers economically, it absorbs human behaviour completely. Even dissent becomes reportable, even reflection becomes inefficiency. Arthur wasn't fired for violence or rebellion or theft. He was removed because he disrupted the emotional rhythm of the machine. He asked questions people no longer wanted to ask. His contract isn't technically terminated. The shifts simply stopped appearing. 0-hour contracts, zero future, zero explanation. And that's what makes modern insecurity so psychologically effective. Nobody has to formally destroy your life anymore. The system simply withdraws stability from you quietly, automatically, like an algorithm correcting an error. Arthur walked home calculating money in his head again. Rent, food, electric, travel, every pound already belongs to something else before he even earned it. And for the first time he realised something horrifying. Working hard was never the promise, and that promise disappeared long ago. Jeff Bezos will never know Arthur exists, not because Bezos is uniquely evil, but because modern systems are now too large, too automated, too abstract for individual suffering to even register anymore. Arthur was told that if he worked hard, stayed disciplined and obeyed the rules, he would build a life. Instead, he became economically replaceable, psychologically exhausted and socially invisible. Just another worker during shift, drifting through a society advanced enough to automate almost everything except human struggle. The cruelest part of modern society isn't that people suffer, it's that millions suffer quietly while being told this is simply normal.